Nancy Oswald Jackson is a lot of things, a successful TV producer, author, and advocate, but the one that has defined her the most is being a mother to a 10-year-old autistic child named Wyatt. Because of him, she is now an advocate for ACT Today, or Autism Care and Treatment, and helps families around the nation get help.
Autism Care and Treatment Today is exactly what the name says. We provide care and treatment for children with autism and their families because it's extremely hard for the average family to afford many of the treatments and therapies that are available for children with autism. It's oftentimes not funded by insurance. The schools are not equipped to handle it in many cases, and it's extremely expensive. And I found this out and got involved because I have a son with autism. My son Wyatt is now 10. He was diagnosed at the age of 3 with high-functioning autism. And he actually at that point was not high-functioning. He was moderately autistic. But I think at the time that he got the diagnosis of high-functioning, I was relieved because I didn't want to hear the diagnosis, of course. I think every parent doesn't want to hear that diagnosis. But I had spent 25 years in the television business as a producer, and I thought that I could access information easily. My pediatrician did not catch the signs of autism at my son Wyatt's 2-year checkup. And because I was a first-time mother at 46, I didn't know about a lot of the normal stages of development, or I didn't see the red flags. So when a lot of the symptoms started coming up when my son was between really around 2 is when I noticed that he wasn't speaking. He had started speaking and then stopped. He was having a lot of tantrums, which is very common in autism. He was having some obsessive behaviors, things like turning lights off and on, lining up toys, wanting to watch the same video over and over. We were worried that he might be losing his hearing. He appeared like he was deaf. If you called his name, he didn't respond. These are all signs of autism, but I didn't know. And finally, when he was almost 3, a neighbor suggested that he might have some signs. I was extremely upset. I called the pediatrician. He was very, that's sort of the latest trendy disease or disorder. I didn't see any signs of autism in him. And I said, we haven't seen him in a year. So I took him in. He was 3 years old. And after spending about 10 minutes with him, he came out and said he's at least a year delayed. So then I started taking him places to get a diagnosis. It wasn't until my son was 4.5 that I went to an autism conference and learned about a therapy called ABA. That stands for Applied Behavioral Analysis. That is a therapy that in many cases, almost in every case, can improve the life of the child, and in many cases can recover, meaning that a child will no longer test as being autistic after having this if you get in early enough and intensively enough. The recommended amount is between 30 and 40 hours a week, starting at the age of as early as 2, if not 18 months, if you can get a diagnosis that early. There are some other therapies. There's occupational therapy, there's speech therapy, there's nutritional therapies. All of these things can help, but ABA has been proven to help a great deal. So then we tried to get my son that therapy. There was a waiting list for 2 years. So when I found all this out, and I thought, if it's this hard for me, a television producer that knows how to find things out and research things, what's it like for a family with no resources?
Jackson says the numbers for autism have gotten worse instead of better in the past few years, and that something needs to be done now.
The rates of autism have skyrocketed. We have an epidemic on our hands, and it's an epidemic that knows no boundaries. It affects all socioeconomic groups. It affects all nationalities and races. It affects all countries. We have an international epidemic. We certainly have a national epidemic. The latest figures, which came out just recently, show that 1 in 88 children have autism. 1 in 54 boys. That's an astronomical number. That is more than pediatric cancer, diabetes, and AIDS combined. Okay, so that is a huge number. It's 1 in 54 boys. In some states, like New Jersey, it's 1 in 12 children. And autism is a spectrum disorder, so it can be from very low functioning, nonverbal children that have very few skills, to very high functioning, which is known as Asperger's syndrome, which the children can be very bright, the individuals can be very bright, but they have a very hard time with social skills. So it's affecting a huge number of the American public and the world right now. So if you don't have a child with autism, you will undoubtedly in this lifetime know someone with autism, have a neighbor or a friend with a child with autism, or have a family member affected.
And if you think this is true only in America, you are wrong. Autism affects not only children here in the U.S., but also in Asia and around the world.
The numbers in Asia are about the same. In South Korea, they did a study about 6 months ago which showed astronomically high numbers. 2.6 of all South Korean children are affected or on the autism spectrum. So those are very, very high numbers. I think it's something like 1 in 6 boys, which you're sort of like, how could this have happened? Now, that's an interesting question. How could this happen? What causes autism? We don't know exactly what causes autism. What we do know is that the term is epigenetic in nature. Now, epigenetic means that there might be genetic reasons for this, but the genetics are changed by environment. So the genetics are affected by environment. So it's impossible to have a genetic epidemic because a genetic epidemic takes generations to develop. It can't happen like this epidemic has happened. So there have to be environmental triggers. We're not really sure which ones. We're not sure. Toxins, pollution, hormones, radiation, chemicals found in our foods, in plastics. But think of all the things. This epidemic has happened in the last 30 years. Back in 1970, 1 in 3,000 children had autism. And so what has happened in the last 30 years? Well, a proliferation of plastics, of toxins, of hormones, of food that has been altered and genetically engineered, ultraviolet rays, radiation, vaccines. We don't know that any of these single things in combination with maybe some specific genetic mutations might all be interacting as sort of a toxic cocktail that triggers autism. Just because a child is nonverbal, we cannot presume that it is not intelligent. There have been instances where children are nonverbal and people think that they treat them like they're vegetables. Then they've gotten assisted technology. They've gotten a keyboard. They've gotten the ability to communicate, and brilliance comes out. So we don't know what is being absorbed by an individual with autism.
Human rights be possible.
Recently, I had the honor of giving a grant to a child that was nearby here in the Los Angeles area, and the grant was for assisted technology for an iPad, and the little boy was almost nonverbal, and I went into his home, and the home was about the size of my living room, and the mother was living there with her 2 children, the older brother and the little boy with autism, and her parents, because her husband had left because he couldn't handle it. And she was going to school at night to study nursing. And I just thought, those are the real heroes. You don't read about them, but those are the real heroes, those moms that are out there really fighting for their kids no matter what. And I have to help when I meet people like that.